Alright guys, so things are getting spicier now. It seems Canada is reaching a breaking point, which is very funny because aren't they supposed to be forever allies with the US? We are witnessing the framework of globalization break down in real time. The Trump effect is causing panic all over the world. The 25% tariff threat on Canadian exports is causing chaos everywhere. And Trump basically mocked the country, saying maybe Justin Trudeau should be the governor of a new US state. It's wow.
That when Trudeau told President elect Trump that new tariffs would kill the Canadian economy, Trump joked to him that if Canada can't survive without ripping off the US to the tune of $100 billion a year, then maybe Canada should become the 51st state and Trudeau could become its governor.
So Canada is the 51st state of the United States. Well, the mockery just got worse. Trump went on Truth Social and he re-emphasized his point on Canada, how dependent the country is on the United States. It was a pleasure to have dinner the other night with Governor Justin Trudeau of the great state of Canada. Now that's quite insulting, but it does highlight the big advantage the US has over Canada. Trade between the two countries is enormous and Canada depends a lot on the US economy to survive. Since the 1980s, Canada has been reliant on selling goods to the US. In 2023, Canada accounted for 13.5% of total US imports, and that is almost on par with Mexico and even higher than China. Trump knows the leverage he has with Canada. If the US goes through with the 25% import tariff, we'll see economic devastation and Canada's GDP will collapse. Let's put things into context here. The Canadian economy is more reliant on exports for economic growth than even China. Chinese exports accounts for 18% of their GDP, and that's a big number by any measure. But for Canada, this dependence is even more striking. A third of their GDP, 33%, comes from their exports to the world. And the United States has an incredible chokehold on the Canadian economy. Canada exported nearly $550 billion worth into the US last year. And get this, that's 77% of Canada's total exports. Canada is like a manufacturing province of the United States, and that's why Trump is mocking it. The reliance is breathtaking. Now imagine what a 25% tariff would do. Income and profits would collapse. Companies could go under and layoffs would follow soon after. So what would Justin Trudeau do? Well, let's hear it directly from him. He talked about how he managed to force the US to back down the last time Trump was president. Canada imposed their own tariffs on US products, which included Heinz ketchup and cherries. We are really entering the twilight zone here.
But our responses to the unfair steel and aluminum tariffs were what ended up lifting those tariffs last time. It was the fact that we put tariffs on bourbon and Harley Davidsons and playing cards and Heinz ketchup and cherries and a number of other things that were very carefully targeted because they were politically impactful.
Here's the problem with Trudeau's plan. The Canadian tariffs back in 2018 targeted a bunch of goods, but you're talking about benign stuff that don't really matter, at least to the consumer. Orange juice, ketchup, and whiskey, they aren't essential products, and the US can always find new places to export them to like Europe or Asia. But a blanket import tariff on Canadian products would crush industries across the country. Canada doesn't have as much leverage as they think, and Trump knows this. Exports alone support nearly 3.3 million Canadian jobs. So 1 in 6 jobs are dependent on the export industry, of which 2 million jobs are dependent on continued free trade with the US. Trump could literally implode the Canadian economy and their industries if he wants. And it seems Canada wants to fight back. The government wants to hit back by exporting less to the US. And here's the plan. Trudeau wants to punish Canadian commodities heading into the US. He could impose export taxes on major commodities, including crude oil, uranium, and potash. The plan is to jack up prices for the end users in the US, so American farmers, businesses, and consumers could all suffer from higher inflation. Now, will this work or backfire? That's the big question here. Firstly, export taxes aren't like import tariffs. If you are an exporter in Canada, you will have to pay a tax or penalty for shipping goods to the US. So if a barrel of oil costs $70 and Canada imposes a 10% tariff, for example, the final selling price would be 77. The exporter, a Canadian company, would have to absorb it. And that means they will pass it down to their customers. In this case, US refiners would be clobbered. Over the last 12 months, Canada exported over $170 billion worth of energy products. A tariff would most definitely hit US fuel makers hard. The US Midwest relies on Canadian crude for half of their refining. So if a tariff happens, prices at the pump would fly up. Gasoline and diesel will cost more, which would trickle down to the rest of the economy. In other words, higher inflation in the United States. So Canada's export tax signals a confrontation with the US, where both economies would be hammered if Trump doesn't back down. Since the 90s, the US has been more reliant on Canadian oil imports. We have gone from just a million barrels a day to 4.3 million barrels, more than 4 times increase. It's not an overstatement to say the US needs cheap Canadian oil to function, especially when Trump wants to bring home manufacturing and industries. Energy costs have to come down. The dependency is real. 60% of US crude imports comes from Canada, and the growth has been steady 4% every single year over the past decade. So it's more like a Mexican standoff. If Trump hits Canada with import tariffs and even if he exempts commodities from punishments, Trudeau could be forced to retaliate. But is this ideal for Canada? Well, it isn't. Export tariffs are meant to force domestic exporters to stop shipping goods overseas. Countries use this to boost domestic consumption of locally produced goods. However, there's a big problem here. Canada can't absorb their entire production. Their industrial base isn't as big as China, so the oil will have to flow elsewhere. Firstly, export tariffs hurt Canadian producers. Doesn't matter if it's oil or uranium, domestic companies would have to cover it. And if the tariffs are too high, the US would simply source from elsewhere, like the Middle East. Trump could also double down and hammer Canada's industrial economy. And here's how big the exposure is for them. The top exporting industries in Canada accounts for 7.4% of the country's GDP. Oil and gas alone is 4.5%, and metal manufacturing is nearly 1%. So while the US suffers from higher inflation, Canada might collapse into recession if Trump's tariffs are high enough. A ton of products have to be diverted to other economies. And here's the rub. Which country or countries are big enough to cover the shortfall? The cost of manufacturing in Canada isn't exactly cheap either. They would have to sell their oil and other products at a big discount. And is Canada prepared for that? Are they ready for that? Because something tells me they aren't. The economic damage won't be even here. Certain provinces could suffer a complete meltdown over a US trade war. And here are the provinces most exposed to the US economy. As a whole, 19% of Canada's GDP comes from merchandise exports to the US, so a fifth of the economy relies on US consumers. However, places like Alberta and New Brunswick have exposure of 33% and above. A tariff war would impact businesses in these provinces, which could cascade down to layoffs and lower salaries. So the impacts are severe. Oil is just one commodity that's under threat. Canada also supplies the US with a ton of uranium. Now, throttling supply here will make the power generation much more expensive. Canada supplies the US with a quarter of their uranium needs, and that's a very substantial amount, especially when we consider Russia has blocked their uranium supply to the US as well. So Trump's trade war is going to be a very risky gamble, and someone has to back down or both economies will be clobbered. Chances are Trump will still hit Canada with tariffs, and Canada will have to impose theirs as well. But I want to underscore why diversifying trading partners is very important. Just like how Russia had $300 billion in US bonds, putting all your money on one country is a very dangerous move. And here are Canada's biggest trading partners. As we know, trade with the US accounts for 77%, and the next country is China, but the disparity is incredible. Only 3.7% for trade with Beijing. Building trading relations takes time, And we know the G7 is fighting an economic battle with the Chinese, so the next biggest economy and market could be closed off as well. Back in August, Trudeau announced shocking tariffs on imports from China to punish Chinese EVs with a 100% levy and a 25% tax on steel imports. And this, of course, was to protect US industries and car makers in Canada. But that also means China now has ammunition to impose their own punishments as well. Canada said China had a ton of overcapacity, the good old G7 argument. However, the only overcapacity I see is tariffs coming from the US. It's important to realize Trump's game plan, which is to move industries back to the US. And if you slap a high enough tariff, you can deindustrialize a country and force them to build factories on US soil. And that's how you weaponize the US consumer market. It's not friendly, but that's how the world works. Globalization is breaking down. And these are the industries in Canada and Mexico most exposed to Trump's tariffs. It also gives us a hint of the sectors that could uproot and move production to the US. Over 100 billion of imports in machinery, 94 billion for electronics, a whopping 200 billion in transportation equipment. So there will be a lot of collateral damage from a trade war in 2025. At the end of the day, it's all a math equation. If Trump raises the tariff high enough, it might be enough for auto companies to return back to the US. Canada has to find a way out. The export tariffs on commodities might not be enough to deter the US. Trump could go full scorched earth and take down everything. In a Canadian survey, they found that people are most worried about their economy and the value of the currency. Over 75% are pessimistic about the Canadian economy as Trump returns. 75% are also worried about the Canadian dollar. And if Trump imposes tariffs and imports less from Canada, the currency could take a nasty tumble. So the situation is far from ideal. It's a standoff that will hurt both economies. The US will suffer from higher energy prices, while overall revenue into Canada would collapse. And as it stands, there's no other alternative for Trudeau. Relations with China is kaput and Europe is too broke to buy anything. But let me know what you think. Can Canada do anything to prevent a trade war with Trump? Can they bargain their way out of this one? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.